Hello, everyone. So I had a couple of family friends send me this Tucker Carlson podcast episode in which he had the guest Calley and Casey Means on, and they are two social media personalities in which they give dietary and lifestyle advice. They're fairly popular in some circles, and I guess people were curious what my opinions on their viewpoints were because they talk a lot about the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry and the food industry and maybe how they kind of all interconnect. I decided to do a video format because an essay would have been probably miserable for me and the person reading through it. So hope you enjoy and look forward to having this conversation. Okay, so I just have a general outline here of how I'm trying to do this presentation. It is going to be broken up into multiple videos. It takes a long time to make these things. I'm learning. So I'm not going to read through I'm not going to read through all of these and insult anyone's intelligence. But just briefly, I did move Calley and Casey Means introduction to like one of my last three bullet points. And in that, I'm going to talk specifically about their philosophies and like a little bit about what I think of maybe their um, maybe what I think of their approach or their thoughts and them maybe a little more personally. And spirituality is actually I thought that this podcast had a very spiritual sentiment to it, and I think that that warrants some attention. So I want to talk about that. And then lastly, general thoughts. I'll probably summarize some of the main ideas. And then I actually want to talk about where I kind of like diverge from them a bit and where I think that some of the dangers and some of the problems in pharmaceutical really lie and how we can resolve those issues. So, yeah, that's basically how we'll lay this out. This is just a disclaimer slide. Really quickly, I thought this would be important to throw in here. I don't mean to misrepresent any arguments. If I do, um, I understand that this video is going out to people who probably don't agree with me on everything. So if I do misrepresent an argument, or if you know of a study or something like that that you can send to me, I would love to read that study. I'm always willing to reevaluate my stances. I am also doing a speed run on some of this stuff because there are things that I hear that set off like a red flag, and then I go, well, let me look into that. And it's like, it might not be a topic that I'm familiar with, so I'll quickly research it and then give my opinions on what I think, if I think something's maybe not so truthful or maybe it's exaggerated or whatever. So, but I'll tend to give those disclaimers where they're at. But again, I just don't want to misrepresent anybody, and even myself. If I give a bad argument, call me out on it. Okay, so this is the first portion that I cover. This is the seed oils and food pyramid section.
issue
Let's
in the country. It's
listen
an
really
issue of
briefly to
corruption
what this
that
clip of
starts with
what
Stanford
Calley
Med
Means is
School being
talking about
50%
here.
funded by pharma and not training doctors on one nutrition class. Stanford Med School, Harvard Med School, 90% of med schools don't offer or require one nutrition class. Doctors simply aren't learning why people are getting sick, which we'd all assume they do. 80% of course loads in pharmacology. It's on
All right. Okay, I apologize for the audio issues on the last slide. I'm just learning how to do this PowerPoint thing, and or maybe I have like the Temu or discount version of PowerPoint or something. So, um, anyways, that's Calley Means for people who don't know. He makes a statement that, medical schools, 50% of funding for medical schools comes from big pharma. That's a fairly straightforward statement. I looked into it. I did some research. I did some digging. I couldn't find that number. I could not find the 50%. I tried adding up some fundings and things like that. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but I didn't find 50%. The highest percentages I found from different articles was that private funding, which would include pharma, private funding for medical schools, only 7% of funds that comes from like private funds, or 7% of income or donations or whatever it is comes from private enterprise, which would include pharmaceuticals. What the mass majority of funding for medical school comes from the government. And this is also true for pharmaceutical industry as well. And to me, that is a kind of an alarming fact, right? That over 90% of your funding is coming from the government. So Calley and Casey Means are going to continually drive home this point throughout this podcast that there's this trifecta. There's the pharma industry, there's the medical establishment like doctors and things, right? And then there is the food industry as well. It's this trifecta, and they're all working together to line each other's pockets. And then the government is obviously getting getting a hand in that money as well. So I have a different philosophy, and I think that the government is controlling and holding back a whole lot of scientific progress, and they have a whole lot of power because, um, you know, because of things like this, they control so much money, and then they are continually working to break down free market and stuff like that. So I have a different approach here, and I think that I'm going to talk about this a lot throughout this series, this series of videos, building of this conspiracy, because it's what it is. I'm not discrediting it. I'm not discrediting it for that. I'm just saying that it is a conspiracy. When there's a conspiring parties, it is technically a conspiracy theory. Building the conspiracy, um, you have to hold a narrative. And I think that holding that narrative sometimes takes away from where we should focus in. And so whenever we do have the opportunity to take control and to make a difference, it's very important that we have our story straight and that we understand things. So saying things like the pharmaceutical industry is funding medical school, and basically there's a conflict of interest and that they're driving the curriculum, when in fact that doesn't look to be the truth, is distracting us from where we should be focusing our energies and in our concerns. So I would rate that statement as of now is very at least at the worst, it's or at the best, it's just a little it's very misleading. That there is one more thing I want to add from the current slide. One more organization I want to talk about, and that's I believe, the American Medical Association. The reason I bring up the American Medical Association is because this is another establishment that has a sort of monopoly on medical schools. And with the AMA, if I recall, it is specific towards the standardized testing. So there's this sort of um, there's this sort of like bureaucracy that exists in some of these medical associations. It doesn't mean that everything they put out is bad, and a lot of doctors who are outspoken against medical establishments will talk about the issues within some of these organizations, and then, when they're talking about something else, they'll state that this medical association, that they'll quote them like as a source of fact. So it's not that everything they do is bad, but when you have one organization that has all this control, again, you might get this sort of repeated way of testing. You might not get new information. A lot of times in those organizations, there's standards that they've been following for years and years and years, and like going outside that status quo could could bring them under heat for different reasons, because lots of times they have ties to government entities. So I think, again, this comes back to focusing our energies in the right directions. So if I was to say there was a problem with funding in medical schools or with the education there, I would point to number one, the massive amount of funding that comes from the government. And number two, I would point to some organizations like these medical associations that sort of have this intellectual monopoly on the testing. but the evidence that pharma is funding medical schools, from what I saw, isn't there, at least at very high rates, like 50%. So Calley Means talks a bit about conflicts of interest between the medical schools and the pharmaceutical establishment. And I think the emphasis here is on the fact that medical schools focus so heavily on pharmaceutical intervention. And he's trying to make a connection here again between money and lining pockets and things. My question, first of all, there are definitely conflicts of interest that exist within these fields. There's also just a level of overlap that occurs naturally in these fields. Like I have doctors that work at my company or people that practice medicine for a while. I actually have someone on my team that was a physician and then decided to come into our industry and now works with us. And it goes vice versa, right? Someone works in pharma for a while and then they go work at a medical school. And they're going to talk about pharma a lot because that's where they've spent a majority of their time. So, but there are conflicts of interest that exist. Um, I could just jump to the second bullet point really quickly and then I'm going to come back. The funding is an example, right? Funding is heavily bureaucratic. It can be. I think that funding for research projects and things needs to be opened up a little more. I think regulations and some of that, again, not to overuse the word, but some of that bureaucracy needs to be held accountable, regulations pulled, and excuse me, and I think a lot could be done with funding for research to help it to be less biased and ensure that we're getting good quality studies. So, but anyways, let me go back really quick. So there's conflicts of interest, but here's a question, and I always try to ask myself this, and I heard a doctor talk about this one time. Are these, as doctors now teaching heavy pharmaceutical, by the way, they don't as much anymore. They're actually moving back more towards holistic approaches as they're discovering more about metabolism and physiology and cellular metabolism, as they're discovering more about medicine and mistakes we've made in the past. Doctors are actually now, they're sort of accompanying the pharmaceutical intervention with more holistic approaches or trying to move away from pharmaceutical interventions where possible. If you want to test this out, next time you go to the doctor, tell them that you're eating tons and tons of processed food and horrible things and, um, see how they react, right? Or tell them the opposite. Tell them that you're on a really good diet, that you're eating well, that you're exercising regularly, that you're not drinking alcohol, that you're not smoking, and see what they say to that, right? So I think that they would definitely appreciate the latter more than the former. And I think doctors are becoming more and more aware of this. So I heard a doctor put it like this, right? Is the heavy pharmaceutical intervention though in medical schools a response to a time in America, and I'm talking like 1800s, early 1900s, where there were high mortality rates, there was all kinds of infectious diseases, there was people dying of septic illness, um, and surgeons, like going to a surgical suite was an absolute nightmare, to a time where we shifted and we discovered things like antibiotics, hand washing, vaccines, and we saw this massive decrease, largely in part thanks to medical interventions. We saw this massive decrease in mortality and, a rise in life expectancy. So, there was like this correlation that didn't necessarily, like, it existed, but, maybe it wasn't, you see this massive increase. Like, I think honestly, one example I heard was infant mortality in 1915. That was the first time they ever recorded was in 1915 infant mortality, and 10% of newborns died. They did all this medical intervention, which I'm going to talk about this more because it's a really kind of crazy story. But they started to intervene more and more and more in the 1900s, after that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and they're actually some of the practices they did. Now we look back on and we like cringe, but they decreased that rate by 93%. So the so some of the medical interventionism was like a response. They were saying, "Oh, look, it works. It works to medically intervene." And I think that, pharmaceutical intervention was sort of the doctrine for a while. It was the way to keep people alive. It was a good thing. Antibiotics is another example. Now doctors don't prescribe antibiotics as much because they realize, hey, when they first discovered them, they were super excited and they were prescribing them left and right and saving lives. And now we're seeing that maybe this had some impacts on other things like our microbiome, or there could be other effects, on like babies and stuff. So, doctors are kind of pulling back on that, and they're prescribing but antibiotics do save lives. We have to also address the fact that antibiotics still serve a purpose and still save lives, but that doctors may have been overprescribing them for a time. So so I keep saying this and then not finishing my train of thought, but I heard a doctor say once that the pendulum swings, right? So the pendulum swings one way, like how we had all these deaths, so then we went heavy to the pharmaceutical industry or whatever, or medical interventionism, let's just call it that, right? Pharmaceutical interventionism. So we swung to that, right? And now it's crazy because people are actually going like assuming that there's something really corrupt going on, so they're swinging the pendulum to the other side. And I think honestly, we need to focus on keeping the pendulum somewhere in the center. So both sides really are wrong. And I think Calley and Casey Means, whether intentionally or not, here they're building a story which is causing the pendulum to swing in one direction very heavily, where we need to bring it in and be honest about what doctors also get right. So I would say that. I think that, by the way, last point here, I think that detaching pharma influence from medical school completely would be impossible, and it would have repercussions. We have to educate doctors on what are good medicines. I think that the best way to prevent corruption is to increase the free market, put lots and lots of options out there, educate doctors on lots of different things too, right? Like holistic, and which they're moving towards. And I talk a little bit about that in this slide about the stuff I learned in school. That I didn't go to medical school, but again, I took courses that they take in med school, and they are starting to focus more on that. And I'm optimistic about this stuff, but I think keeping the free market open, keeping lots of pharmaceutical options there, and then but also not neglecting the holistic approach, and I think we move towards a better future for med. Okay, so Calley Means makes a statement that doctors are not trained on nutrition in his in this clip, and that is simply not true. Most medical schools, if not all of them, require 24 hours of a focus on nutrition. Most medical schools require a nutrition course in the second semester. Now, I don't know if that's true for all med schools, but the majority of them, they do take a nutrition course specifically. If the med schools break it up to where you just have to talk about a total of 25 hours of nutrition, I could see that too. I'll give an anecdotal, I'll give a little anecdotal evidence. I got a master's in biomedical science. That class was 2 years of medical school courses. It was like the first 2 years of med school. And I took the exact same courses that the med students took, or at least the majority of them. When I took medical biochemistry, when we talked about a lot of diseases, if you could treat it with a diet, you talked about that first, like obesity. When we got to the section on obesity, the textbook, the clinical studies, therapies, it was all about diet and exercise, talking to your patient about getting on a good diet and exercise, and then following up with them constantly. There does come a point where a doctor can only do so much. If a patient, it won't meet them halfway and they're obese and they're having all these physiological issues, then a doctor thinks like this, okay, I have to do something. I have to get their weight down. I have to control their blood sugar or they're going to die. So I have to prescribe them insulin. One of the reasons that insulin is as high as it is in cost, is because of the demand in America. So, it's not just that doctors are just prescribing it out. It's also that Americans like to eat and we like to eat lots of bad foods. Uh, so, some of the reason that drug prices are the way they are is just supply and demand. That is true. Um, Also, by the way, I'm going to talk about Ozempic later. And I was going to bring this point up, but Mayo Clinic just released, they released like a monthly newsletter. And in their monthly newsletter, they talked about Ozempic. And do you know what they said about Ozempic? They didn't say, oh, yeah, give this to your patients. It's a great drug. It's a miracle drug. No, they said that most patients will relapse in weight gain with Ozempic and that you need to um, highly, you need to push and emphasize dietary and lifestyle changes. So doctors aren't just trying to prescribe you Ozempic. Like that article was saying, push those lifestyle changes. Okay, the next point. So that point is made about nutrition. Doctors are trained in nutrition. Whether doctors take that education into their practice, that's on the doctors. But doctors should understand human nutrition. Almost every single textbook I read had segments on essential vitamins, non-essential vitamins, how you get it from your diet, how to eat a balanced diet. What happens if you eat too many? The doctors know about processed foods. In fact, I challenge you, go ask any doctor. Tell them you're eating a diet high in processed foods and see if they say to you, oh, yeah, that's great. Or tell them the contrary. Hey, I exercise every day. I eat whole foods. I watch what I eat. I watch my caloric intake. And what are they? I guarantee every doctor is going to like the latter, not the former. They're not going to push you to be on processed foods so they can pump you full of drugs. And they're going to know processed foods aren't good for you. Doctors not educated on what makes us sick. Now, I'm going to give Calley Means the benefit of the doubt here. I think he's talking about new diseases. And this is true. Doctors are educated in diagnosis and treatment. That's how they're educated. That there is a level of rote memorization, which I think needs to be addressed in medical schools. I think that the push for doctors to just memorize symptoms, list them out, and then diagnose and then treat based off of that isn't good. So there's that. And I think with newer illnesses, because there's such heavy emphasis on treatment, because we have access to so many drugs now, because we're learning so much that, sometimes this does happen. But you also have to understand this. There's a whole nother segment out there of scientists and engineers and research and development. And America, by the way, is the lead. We are the lead in research and development. So we push out a lot of good science every single year, and we are competitors on the world stage. No one's even close to touching us. China is still we still make like 3 times more drugs than they do. So this is actually a good thing for the American economy. So all these attacks on big pharma, in fact, a lot of the big attacks from big pharma come in the form of regulation and laws and drug price controls. These things all damage us. They damage us economically. So anyways, maybe doctors aren't as educated as they should be on what makes us sick. But doctors do take courses in pathology. Doctors are aware of the history of a lot of diseases and how they were discovered and what they're caused. And you can use those as a template for new diseases. Hey, so and so discovered this years and years ago. Maybe there's a similar thing. And doctors still discover a lot of stuff and fix a lot of problems in our med system. It just sometimes takes a lot longer than it should. But that's sort of the history of science generally. So again, I think this point is another point that's a little bit embellished or hyperbolic, whatever you want to say. Yeah. Okay. I want to clarify a point on my last slide. I can't like go back in and edit these things. It's too difficult to just edit a segment. So I'm just going to make it a slide. What I meant by when I said there's a whole nother segment out there of scientists, engineers, and research and development, a lot of the scientists are focused on what causes the disease and how to treat the disease. So, and people say, oh, they're focused on a treatment, not a cure. I can get into all that, but it's going to be a much longer podcast. Here's the truth, just up front. Most diseases that we understand are much more complicated once they progress to a point of disease, like autoimmunity or a genetic illness or something like that. They are cancers. Cancers are a big one. They are so complicated and they're so different. It's not a simple fix. So just saying that, keep that in mind. But there are scientists out there that are working very, very hard to try to find cures for illnesses or at the very least effective treatments. The way we keep those treatments costs down is through, and the way that we actually, I think, improve our probability of finding cures is through free market deregulation. I'm going to drive these points home so much, and also through increasing scientific discord, which I do think there is a little bit of again these intellectual monopolies. And I'll talk about this stuff more and more throughout the slides as they come up. But just want to clarify that point because I kind of like went off on a tangent. So the lobbying in pharma is at a much higher percentage than it is in any other industry, including things like the oil industry. And it just doesn't really surprise me. It doesn't, oil is a heavily lobbied industry as well. I think that the government has sunk its fangs or dug its roots into these industries so much that it's almost like you don't have a choice but to sometimes need the help of the government in order to survive. And it's not really the fault always of pharma. Sometimes it's the fault of actually the public. The public demands accountability to the pharmaceutical industry. They demand it in the form of government regulations and laws. And this actually happened with the polio vaccine in the early 1900s when the polio vaccine was developed. There was a manufacturing incident at one of the labs. Polio vaccine was a great vaccine. It saved a lot of lives, and it stopped the outbreak of polio, but and greatly decreased it. But the in America at least, but there was a manufacturing incident, and a few kids died. And the every time there's a vaccine innovation, there's going to be kind of like an anti-vax response to it. It's just how vaccines, it's just how it works, it's and that's just part of the process. But the sort of the anti-vax vaccine community against the polio vaccine had pushed heavy for the government to get involved, and so you got the Biologics Act out of that, and you got an expansion of one of it's either the FDA or the NIH, and but like there's plenty of examples of this that don't involve vaccines where the government finds a way to get involved and they get involved. And a lot of that stems from regulation, and it grows and grows. And the lobbying has to stop. I think one way to stop that is through deregulation, but the relationship is so intertwined that it's difficult. I also think the free market could solve the problem. Um, but this doesn't surprise me. This is a problem. Obviously, this can become a problem. I think again to come back to the free market, as long as we have competition, this is okay. This is manageable. I'm not gonna say it's okay, but it's manageable. Once it grows into once it if it ever monopolizes, that's when it becomes a really big problem because you can have a whole lot of influence over what one or two or three companies do. Yeah, if you're controlling the money. So, it's definitely something to keep our eyes on and to speak out about. Um, the processed food industry was created by the tobacco industry. That is like 100% true actually. And again, I don't think it's like doom or gloom, and I don't think it's part of a conspiracy necessarily. I think that people who were good at making things that were addictive made food, and this is what you got, right? You can regulate it, right? That's one option. You can use the government. They can come in, they can enforce laws, or you can educate yourself and not buy the products. And there is a lot of education around this. I think actually in 2000 people became aware of this very fact and started to buy less and less. And then then also I think regulations came out of it. But another thing is that actually sugar consumption in the United States over the past like 15 years has been decreasing steadily, like added sugar and things. So I do think people are becoming privy to this, and they're starting to make healthier decisions. And you have to actually thank the scientific and medical establishment that this is happening. It's just taking a lot longer than it should for it to happen. Um, so yeah, I think to keep educating people, keep making good decisions, and then obviously allowing for companies to come up that make alternatives, and I think that's the solution. Okay, I clipped this little segment about the food pyramid. Um, so let's check it out.
They shifted their thousands of scientists who were experts at making cigarettes addictive to the food department. So we had the rise of They shifted their thousands of scientists who were experts at making cigarettes addictive to the food department. So we had the rise of ultra processed food where our food now is a science experiment. The second thing they did is they shifted their lobbying. So the cigarette industry, of course, was the biggest, lobbying spenders and had a good playbook. They shifted their playbook on lobbying and rigging institutions of trust to food. So they created the food pyramid. So the cigarette industry, through the food companies they bought, paid off the FDA, the USDA, Harvard to create reports saying sugar doesn't cause obesity. And they lobbied for the food pyramid in the 1990s, we all remember, which said, animal-based fats are bad, carbs are good. Remember, carbs and sugar were basically the base of the pyramid. So the American diet, because of that, because we trust our medical institutions, which they know, we shifted our diet significantly to ultra-processed food. It was very intentional, the food pyramid. That was a ultra-processed food marketing document that carbs were fine, sugar was fine. And that shifted, and you look at dietary patterns. Today, a child diet is 70% ultra-processed food. Now, what does that mean? They shifted their thousands.
So there might be a slight echo in the video because the way the speakers are, like you told me, reach up earlier. The way the speakers are, they kind of they might create like a very light echo, and I apologize for that. I don't really know how to fix it. Okay, so next slide, I'll talk about these points. Oh, the food pyramid. This one's fun. This one's always fun to talk about. I think the food pyramid is a really um, exciting and heavily utilized argument, especially in sort of like the health influencers on social media. They love to talk about the food pyramid controversy, and it is an interesting history. So the first thing I'll say is just like everything, there's two sides to every story. And I would encourage you to read the other side of the story. I linked it here in the slide. It's the article there by Marion Nessel. She is no relation to the Nestle Corporation, though she does tend to have some more of the, I wouldn't even call them orthodox views anymore, but she sort of aligns with the food pyramid in some ways. She does acknowledge, I believe, her philosophy. I don't know everything about her, but I do know that her philosophy is that, we should have some fats in our diets, healthier fats and whatnot, and that maybe saturated fat was demonized a little too heavily by the food pyramid. But for the most part, she defends some things about the food pyramid and its history. So I think to trace the history of the food pyramid, you have to go back, and you have to really go back to that point in the 1900s where we had vaccine or I guess the invention of vaccines, the implementation of hand washing, and then the invention of antibiotics. So what happened was during that period of time, there was this tapering off of deaths from infectious diseases and septic illnesses, and people started to live longer. But another health crisis emerged, and it was this sudden cardiac these sudden cardiac deaths. Doctors and scientists eventually traced this to plaques in the cardiovascular system, and it led to some really bad ideas. One of those was that dietary cholesterol translated to serum cholesterol, and that led to high cholesterol levels. Also, that your fats, especially saturated fats, were correlating to higher cholesterol levels, and that was also leading people to die of these cardiac events. So, out of these philosophies, a guy named Keynes, I always mess his name up, invented the food pyramid, and he did have a lot of influence within some of these medical establishments. And in a way, he kind of weaponized his knowledge, but I don't think I think there was like this heavy, when you read about the history, I think there's this heavy like group think that emerged out of his ideas. I don't, there's like conspiracies about money and stuff, but I think they're kind of weak in terms of how, when you look into them. Like, I honestly think when you read the history, it was just a heavy dose of groupthink that surrounded the industry. And you did have some people speaking out against it, and eventually it was this the food pyramid was rejected. I mean, it's been rejected since I think the two it's a relic of the 1990s, and it hasn't really 2015. In fact, the USDA updated their guidelines and included fats. And leading up to that, even before 2015, there was lots of talk about incorporating healthy fats into our diets. So let's briefly look at the food pyramid, because Calley Means does say, it advocated, he says something about it advocating for eating sugar. And I will give it this, all right? It says here, use sparingly sweets, and on the side, it looks like it's trying to emphasize added sugars. The problem with the food pyramid is really, this is the problem with it when you read these other articles here, is that it was vague. And that was one of the biggest reasons it was redacted and gotten rid of, because it was just people didn't understand what they were supposed to do. Also, it bunched in fats and oils with sweets, and it even says fats. It's got them sprinkled in here, right? Like, but it says naturally occurring and added fats. This is again extremely misleading, because we know that naturally occurring fats are much better for you now than added fats, right? You don't want fats from processed foods. That's common knowledge to most people. Another criticism is that, they had grains and pastas and things here on the bottom. And I want to quickly bring back up the pendulum swinging. So one of the things I see people do is, well, you know what? They were hiding the fact that saturated fats were actually good for us, so there must be something to that. And the fact that the carbs are on the bottom here actually means they're bad for you. And so, you have this pendulum swing reaction to you have this pendulum swing reaction to the food pyramid. And I believe this to be true. I think in the next like few years, as more and more research comes out about diet and nutrition, and we discover more, if we demonize carbs, we're really going to regret it, because as they're discovering more about carbs, they're finding that there's all kinds of carbs, just like there's all kinds of fats and that do all different kinds of things. And we don't need to neglect having fats in our diets, obviously aside from processed foods, and then trans fats and things like that. But for the most part, we need to incorporate fats in our diets. The same thing with carbs. There's all kinds of really good carbs, and there's some really cool stuff actually about carbs and their impact on our microbiome, which is our gut bacteria. How when we take in the right kinds of carbs, they produce these molecules that increase satiation and can have impacts on our central nervous system. And I'm sure we're going to find out more and more things about those. So I don't think neglecting carbs is a good thing either. Again, I think that the problem with the food pyramid was that it was extremely vague. If you look like at this grouping here, I don't see anything wrong. Like, this actually looks like a fairly decent diet, right? A Mediterranean style diet. So I don't think that the conspiracies, the conspiracies, though, are some of the criticisms of the food pyramid that are a little more radical are true. But I do think that the food pyramid overall was not a very good model for how we should eat or approach diet. Let's talk a little bit about saturated fat. So saturated fat is still a point of contention. So years ago, there was a study done. It wasn't a great study, but it dismantled the stigma around having saturated fat in your diet. So it followed a group of people and showed that they really had no increased risk of cardiovascular events compared to other groups that ate healthier. It was published in Time Magazine, all over the place. Time Magazine had a front page, right? Eat the butter. And it blew up. I think it blew up definitely in like America, where we tend to prize our high saturated fat diets, and we've been demonized all this time that, well, you were eating so bad, Americans eat so bad. But look, after all, we weren't eating so bad. So here's the thing. That study has been reevaluated now, and it's not as exciting. The reevaluation of the study was not nearly as exciting as the Time magazine headline "Eat the Butter," right? Because "Eat Your Fruits and Vegetables" is not near, it doesn't sell nearly as many copies as something so sensational that goes against the status quo. The truth is that study was flawed because it only followed saturated fat intake. It looked at one specific nutrient, and it followed people based off of that. It didn't look at lifestyle, didn't look at where they were getting their saturated fats from. Um, it didn't look, were they eating lots of processed foods? Were they eating lots of whole foods and exercising? All this. And so now more and more studies have been done. And the thing is that saturated fat, I believe, was demonized in the food pyramid originally. And again, I'll reiterate here, the people that designed the food pyramid knew at the time that saturated fat probably wasn't that bad, less bad for you as they were kind of making it out to be in the food pyramid, but they thought Americans already eat a lot of it, so we'll just, you know, put it in very small quantities and maybe Americans will eat less. Not the most comforting way to communicate information to people. But anyways, what is the truth about saturated fat? I think saturated fat should be included in everyone's diet. I think people need saturated fat. But saturated fat does follow, based off of lots of studies that they've done, saturated fat does follow what we call an S-shaped trend. Okay, so on the x-axis here, you would have your quantity. You would measure your quantity, and then on the y-axis, you would measure mortality. So uh, another thing that follows this S-shaped trend is alcohol. So one or two drinks a day, probably really no significant effect on your health, but once you exceed that second drink, mortality starts to increase exponentially. The same problem occurs, or the same sort of trend or pattern occurs with saturated fat. So for men, I think men it's suggested to have less than 30 grams a day, and for women, 20. After you exceed that, we start to see this heavy increase in mortality and disease. Now, there's a few caveats, right? There are some people that can eat probably a lot of saturated fat and never have a health issue. That's just personalized health. That varies from person to person. We all know someone who smoked their whole life and they lived till they were 95 years old. The thing is, you can't go anecdotally, right? You have to look at the big picture. You have to look at the data. And data shows that most people that smoke a lot die younger than people that don't smoke. People that exercise frequently tend to live longer, right? So the thing with saturated fat is the same thing applies, right? Like you might go your whole life, eat tons of saturated fat and be fine. The other thing about saturated fat that we have to keep in mind is this. Saturated fat, the statement saturated fat is healthy is often used in a lot of trendy diets nowadays, right? So they took that sort of study that was like revolutionary and they ran with it. And we started getting a lot of trend diets out of that. And those trend diets don't take into fact this, I think, which is saturated fat is healthy, but in comparison to what? Saturated fat is healthy compared to added sugars? Sure. Saturated fat is healthy compared to trans fat? Yeah, sure. Saturated fat is from natural sources is more healthy than saturated fat from processed foods. I agree that again, yes. But is saturated fat healthier than say poly unsaturated and mono unsaturated fats? No. And there's a plethora of evidence out there that proves this point. So the thing is that, there are healthier sources of fat. I do believe you should be getting saturated fat in your diet, but I think the idea that you can just eat as much saturated fat as you want without consequence isn't true. And we still have to be careful with our saturated fat intake. The first two bullet points, I don't think there's much controversy over those. Added sugars, ultra processed grains are both bad for you. In fact, added sugars other than probably trans fats are probably one of the worst things you can put into your body or include in your diet. You should really limit added sugars if you can. So, I just want to jump into seed oils, and just a trigger warning right off the bat. You're probably going to turn me off like halfway through this, but I diverge from Calley Means on seed oils. But just to put this out here, I am not invested in seed oils or anything, and I am completely open to this argument. I'm completely open to the anti-seed oil argument, and I think you can have a very healthy diet without touching any seed oils. So it's not like it's an essential thing that you need. And lastly, the only thing I have heard that like you shouldn't fry or whatever in olive oil. I've heard that from people who cook. Um, I don't know anything about cooking, so, but I take their word for it. So maybe you just fry whenever you fry things, you maybe have to use seed oils or some alternative. But other than that, I think you can really have a very healthy diet without having any seed oils. However, I wanted to quell some of the sensationalism. I think a lot of social media influencers utilize the seed oil sensationalism to push certain narratives and probably to get views. Seed oils are they're an easy thing to pick on because they're in a lot of foods and they are associated and incorporated into a lot of processed foods. I think that creates a confounding effect, and seed oils are associated with negative health outcomes, even though when seed oils are actually pulled out of you isolate them and you test them on their own, they perform really, really well, and you get a very interesting result. You get very positive results actually from pro seed oil diets. Uh, I am aware of the studies to where there was increase in inflammatory markers or there were negative outcomes, and at least the studies that I saw, and again, this is an argument I'm open to, and I would be more than happy to look into other sources. But from the studies that I had looked into, and I did research this topic heavily months and months and months ago, um, for my own interest, what I saw was that those bad studies where you saw the increase in inflammatory markers and you saw sort of the negative health effects, they were either in vitro studies, which means they were done in like a petri dish, or they were done in mice. Mice are just as a general rule, mice are a very animal models are bad in general, but mice are but they do serve their purposes for certain things. Mice tend to be really good for genetic studies, but mice are really not a great model for health studies. Mice have a totally different metabolism than human beings. Just as a just as something like a general principle to think about to kind of illustrate this, mice live for about 1 year. Human beings, on the other hand, live 80 years, on average, 70 to 80 years. So, uh, whenever you do a study on a mouse, you have to account for that. And dietary studies on mice really have to be taken with a grain of salt. I've seen a lot of people try to advocate for like anti artificial sweeteners, and they'll pull like on YouTube and stuff, different influencers, and they'll pull these studies, and I looked them up, and they were done on mice, and then you can find studies on humans with the same artificial sweetener, and you don't even see close to the same outcome. The same thing seems to be the case for seed oils, is when these studies are translated to human models, and there's lots of studies on seed oils that are done in a randomized clinical control environment, you do not see the negative outcomes. In fact, when you study seed oils, and when researchers have studied seed oils, they see positive results. They see decrease in certain inflammatory markers. They see decrease in mortality associated with cardiovascular disease and again like more markers for mortality, and they also see some control of like blood glucose levels. So, and again, that would actually be associated with I think that would be associated with anti-inflammation because I think sometimes inflammation can be assisted by um, stress hormones and stuff. But don't quote me on that. So again, I think seed oils when they're translated to humans, they're actually not so bad. And there's tons and tons and tons of evidence out there, and you can look into that. You can look into those things. You just type in randomized clinical control plus seed oil on the internet. You'll find a lot of resources if you want to read for yourself. Lastly, I just want to draw I just want to draw to another point, and that is that seed oils have been used in other civilizations for a very long time. There's sort of this conspiracy around the Rothschilds and how seed oils were created and all that. But when you look at the history, they were used a lot in like ancient China. You could also, could have this wrong, but like some northern European countries heavily utilize seed oils, and they seem when you look at those population studies, um, I want to think I ran across a study from northern Europe, and they had healthier markers and stuff. But I could be mistaking it for something else. But anyways, they're definitely used in ancient China. And so, to me, that sort of debunks that whole thing that they just emerged randomly out of some like need for mass manufacturing. But yeah, so I think seed oils are kind of like, they're just, I think that they're, again, sensationalized, and I think that having seed oils, as long as you're not eating tons of processed food, that you'll be perfectly fine if you're having some trail mix and it's got some palm seed oil or something like that in it. I think that's probably much better for you to eat than a lot of other things. So um, anyways, that is my opinion on the seed oil controversy. Okay, so that wraps up part one. Next slide, I think we will talk more about vaccines and things. I'm pretty excited to explore that topic. I appreciate everyone listening in, and look forward to maybe some conversations around this video. Thanks.